There is a question that most people are afraid to ask out loud, not because it lacks evidence, but because answering it honestly forces uncomfortable conclusions. And that question is this: why does modern society seem more disturbed by a man finding peace than by a man being miserable? That question sits at the center of everything we are about to discuss. And if you stay until the end of this video, you will understand why so many men are choosing silence, distance, and independence instead of relationships, arguments, and endless compromise. What we are seeing right now is not a phase, it is not a trend, and it is not a backlash. It is a withdrawal, and once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it. Before we go any further, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you get every single Angry Guy video the moment it is released. This channel exists because these conversations are not happening anywhere else honestly, and your support makes that possible. Also, if you want to protect and safeguard your assets and learn how to grow your wealth in an unstable world, check out Angry's Crypto Academy. The Academy teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, and it is linked in the description of this video. So go check it out now and take control of your financial future instead of leaving it in someone else's hands. And if you're enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to keep this work going, and it is genuinely appreciated. Now, let us get into the heart of this discussion, because what we are talking about today is not just relationships, it is power, control, and emotional incentives. And once you understand those forces, the behavior you see everywhere suddenly makes sense. There have been multiple surveys and behavioral studies over the last several years showing something that at first sounds absurd, but becomes obvious when you look at it closely. Many women report experiencing stronger, positive emotional responses when their pets appear happy than when their romantic partners appear happy. This is not about animals versus people. This is about control, predictability, and dependency. A pet's happiness is non threatening. It does not signal independence. It does not suggest the pet might leave. It does not imply boundaries, self direction, or emotional autonomy. A happy pet is still fully dependent. A happy man, however, represents something very different. A happy man is harder to influence. A happy man does not need constant reassurance. A happy man is more likely to say no. And that creates tension in dynamics that rely on emotional leverage rather than mutual respect. When a man is exhausted, uncertain, and constantly trying to earn approval, he is easier to direct. He adjusts himself, he explains himself, he apologizes even when he is not wrong. But when a man becomes content with himself, when his happiness is internal rather than negotiated, the dynamic shifts. He stops chasing validation. He becomes selective with his time. He does not tolerate chaos for the sake of companionship. And that is where friction appears. Because systems built around emotional dependency do not function well when one side opts out. Over decades, men were told that their value was conditional. They were told they had to earn their place constantly. They were told that masculinity itself was suspicious, that ambition was selfish, that boundaries were hostility, and that silence was avoidance. Entire narratives were built framing men as problems to be managed rather than people to be understood. Boys were taught early to suppress instinct and replace it with compliance. And for a long time, many listened, not because it worked, but because they believed participation was mandatory. Cultural movements promised balance and fairness, but often delivered something else entirely. Language was reshaped to redefine normal behavior as suspect. Everyday actions were reinterpreted through adversarial lenses. Men learned that being observed was not neutral. A glance could be misread, a word could be reframed, an intention could be rewritten after the fact. Over time, this produced caution and eventually withdrawal, not anger, not rebellion, withdrawal. Legal systems reinforced the message. Many men watched peers lose access to their children, their savings, their stability, not because of wrongdoing, but because of structural incentives that rewarded conflict. They saw how easily accusations could become permanent records, regardless of outcome. They saw how expensive it was to defend themselves, even when they were right. And slowly, rational calculation replaced emotional optimism. Participation no longer made sense. Social environments followed the same pattern. Public spaces that once encouraged interaction became zones of risk. Men learned that approaching politely could still be framed negatively. Silence became safer than conversation. Distance became protection. Recording devices turned every misunderstanding into potential spectacle. Reputation became fragile. The cost of being misunderstood grew too high. Dating culture absorbed these changes and amplified them. Expectations increased while accountability disappeared. Men were expected to invest time, money, and emotional labor up front with no assurance of good faith. The transaction was clear, even when the language denied it. Effort flowed in one direction. Risk flowed in one direction. Consequences flowed in one direction. And eventually, men noticed. At the same time, men were told they were not needed. That independence meant exclusion rather than cooperation. That self sufficiency was proof of redundancy. The message was repeated often enough that it stuck. And so men adjusted. They stopped offering what was not valued. They stopped providing what was taken for granted. They stopped competing in systems where the rules changed mid game. What happened next was not loud. There were no marches, there were no slogans. Men simply stepped back. They declined invitations. They canceled dates. They redirected energy. They invested in themselves. They learned skills. They simplified their lives. They chose peace over approval. Something important happened during that transition. Men discovered that being alone is not the same as feeling lonely. Many realized that their stress levels dropped dramatically once constant negotiation was removed from their lives. Their finances stabilized, their routines improved, their sleep returned, their sense of self sharpened, and most importantly, they realized that happiness did not require permission. Minimalism played a role here. Men began removing unnecessary obligations. Fewer possessions, fewer commitments, fewer arguments. They built lives that fit their actual needs rather than external expectations. Comfort replaced chaos. Calm replaced urgency. Control replaced anxiety. This was not about resentment, it was about clarity. As men withdrew, the effects became visible. Dating markets shifted. Attention became scarce. Validation loops weakened. For the first time, many women encountered an environment where male attention was not guaranteed. The same behaviors that once carried no cost suddenly produced silence. The same demands that once worked were met with indifference. And confusion followed. Some responded with reflection, others responded with frustration. Public commentary increased. Complaints about loneliness and financial strain became common. Calls for men to return to traditional roles resurfaced. The irony was obvious. Men were told for years that they were unnecessary, and now they were being asked why they left. But men had learned something crucial. They learned to trust observable reality over promises. They learned that patterns matter more than slogans. They learned that peace is not something to sacrifice lightly. And once learned, that lesson does not disappear. This is why a happy man is disruptive to systems built on emotional leverage. Happiness removes fear. It removes urgency. It removes the need to comply for survival. A man who is content can walk away from disrespect without drama. He can decline manipulation without explanation. He can live well without external validation. That does not make him hostile. It makes him autonomous. And autonomy is the one thing that cannot be negotiated away. We are now seeing the long term consequences of decades of messaging that misunderstood male psychology. Men were not conditioned to disappear overnight. They were pushed slowly, consistently, until departure became logical. And now many are gone. not physically, but emotionally and socially. They are present at work. They are present in their routines, but they are no longer participating in systems that offer risk without reward. This is not collapse, it is reallocation. Energy is finite, attention is valuable. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. Men are choosing where to invest both carefully. They are prioritizing health, finances, peace, and personal goals. They are building lives that make sense to them, and they are doing it quietly. The most interesting part of all of this is how predictable it is. When you remove incentives, behavior changes. When you punish participation, people stop participating. When you reward conflict, conflict increases. None of this requires ideology, it requires only observation. Men did not leave because they were told to, they left because staying stopped making sense. And once a man experiences life without constant friction, without constant suspicion, without constant emotional taxation, returning becomes unlikely. This is where we are now, a society adjusting to the absence of something it assumed was permanent, and men adjusting to lives that feel lighter, clearer, and more honest. And the conversation that must happen next is not about blame, but about reality. To understand why this withdrawal is accelerating rather than slowing down, you have to look at how incentives shape behavior over time. People do not respond to words, they respond to outcomes. Men were told repeatedly that relationships would bring fulfillment, stability, and partnership, yet what many experienced instead was stress, uncertainty, and constant negotiation. Over time, the gap between the promise and the reality became too wide to ignore. When effort consistently produces diminishing returns, rational people adjust. This is not bitterness. This is learning. For years, men were instructed to communicate more, open up more, share more, and be more emotionally expressive. Many did exactly that, only to find that vulnerability was often stored, reframed, or weaponized later during conflict. This created a powerful lesson. Openness did not lead to understanding, it led to exposure. Men learned that silence was safer than honesty, not because honesty was wrong, but because it carried disproportionate risk. Over time, emotional restraint replaced emotional sharing, not out of coldness, but out of self preservation. At the same time, men watched accountability slowly evaporate from many interactions. Expectations remained high, but consequences for unfair behavior became rare or non existent. When someone knows there is no cost for creating chaos, chaos becomes normalized. Men found themselves apologizing to restore peace rather than because they were wrong. They learned that maintaining harmony required constant concession. Eventually, many realized that peace obtained through surrender was not peace at all. This is where the idea of happiness becomes so central. Happiness for a man is not noise or excitement. It is stability, predictability, and autonomy. It is waking up without dread. It is returning home to calm. It is knowing that your efforts will not be punished or dismissed. When men found these conditions outside of relationships rather than inside them, the conclusion was unavoidable. Happiness was easier to maintain alone. Another factor that accelerated the shift was the increasing visibility of patterns through social media. Men no longer relied solely on personal experience. They could observe thousands of examples playing out publicly. Court outcomes, public accusations, reputational damage, and social punishment became visible in real time. What was once anecdotal became statistical. Men compared notes without speaking. They watched. They learned. They adjusted. This quiet learning process is often misunderstood. It is not driven by anger or revenge, it is driven by risk assessment. When men see repeated examples of one sided consequences, they incorporate that information into their decisions. The same way investors leave unstable markets, men leave unstable dynamics. This is not ideological, it is pragmatic. As men redirected their energy, something unexpected happened. Many began to thrive. Without constant emotional turbulence, focus improved, careers advanced, physical health improved, mental clarity returned. Time once spent managing conflict was invested in skill building, fitness, creativity, and rest. The idea that men would collapse without romantic validation turned out to be false. Many discovered they were stronger without it. This realization challenged long held assumptions. For decades, men were told they needed relationships to be complete, that without a partner, they were deficient. But reality contradicted the narrative. Men found fulfillment in mastery, purpose, and self respect. They found meaning in building things, learning, and refining themselves. Companionship was no longer a requirement for identity. Meanwhile, cultural messaging struggled to adapt. Old scripts no longer worked. Shame tactics lost effectiveness. Fear based appeals fell flat. Men who were at peace could not be frightened back into participation. They had already experienced life without constant scrutiny. They had already tasted quiet. And once experienced, quiet becomes addictive. The response to this shift has been revealing. Instead of asking why men left, many voices demanded their return. Instead of addressing structural issues, blame was reassigned. Men were accused of being selfish, immature, or afraid, yet these accusations ignored the core issue. Men did not leave because they were afraid of responsibility. They left because responsibility was no longer paired with authority, respect, or security. A man who invests time, money, and effort expects fairness. He expects predictability. He expects that the rules will be applied consistently. When those expectations are violated repeatedly, withdrawal becomes the rational choice. This is not about avoiding contribution, it is about refusing exploitation. One of the most striking outcomes of this movement is how little noise it generates. Men walking away do not announce themselves. They do not seek applause. They simply disengage. They decline dates. They stop initiating. They reduce emotional exposure. They simplify their lives. From the outside, it can look like apathy. From the inside, it feels like relief. There's also a generational component to the shift. Younger men are observing older men's experiences and adjusting earlier. They are opting out before accumulating damage. They are prioritizing independence from the beginning. This does not mean they reject companionship entirely. It means they approach it cautiously, selectively, and without illusion. Older men, meanwhile, are recalibrating after experience. Many have already paid the price of idealism. They have seen how quickly stability can disappear. For them, withdrawal is not theoretical, it is earned. What unites both groups is pattern recognition. Once patterns are seen clearly, denial becomes impossible. Men recognize that systems reward certain behaviors and punish others. They align themselves accordingly. This is not emotional, it is analytical. Another misunderstood aspect of this movement is that it is not anti anyone, it is pro self. Men are not organizing against women, they are organizing their own lives. They are not seeking to dominate, they are seeking peace. They are not demanding change, they are adapting to reality. This distinction matters. Movements driven by anger burn out, movements driven by clarity endure. Men walking away are not fueled by outrage, they are fueled by calm decision making, and calm decisions are hard to reverse. As this continues, societal structures are forced to adjust. Markets change when participants leave. Norms change when incentives fail. We are seeing the early stages of that adjustment now. Dating norms are shifting, expectations are being renegotiated, silence is becoming common where noise once dominated. The challenge is that many systems were built assuming unlimited male participation. When that assumption fails, friction increases, confusion spreads. But rather than addressing the root causes, many narratives attempt to guilt men back into compliance. This approach misunderstands the moment entirely. Guilt only works when someone believes they owe participation. Men who have rebuilt their lives around autonomy no longer accept unearned obligations. They contribute where contribution is valued. They disengage where it is not. This creates a fork in the road. One path involves introspection, accountability, and structural reform. The other involves doubling down on denial and blame. History suggests that systems rarely choose, introspection willingly. They change only when forced by reality. Men walking away represent that forcing function, not through confrontation, but through absence, not through protest, but through non participation. And absence is powerful because it cannot be argued with, it simply exists. What happens next depends on whether society chooses to observe honestly or react emotionally. Observation would reveal that stability, respect, and mutual accountability are attractive to men. Reaction would attempt to shame men into returning to unstable environments. Only one of those approaches has a chance of working. For now, men are content to wait. They are building quiet lives. They are conserving energy. They are choosing environments that reward effort rather than punish it. And they are doing so without drama. This is not the end of relationships. It is the end of unbalanced ones. It is the end of automatic participation. It is the end of silence about observable reality. Men did not disappear. They simply stepped out of systems that no longer made sense. And until those systems change, the silence will continue. This is the reality many are only beginning to notice. And once noticed, it cannot be undone. One of the most misunderstood aspects of what is happening right now is the idea that men are leaving because they failed, because they could not adapt, or because they were somehow not good enough to meet modern expectations. That framing is comforting for systems that do not want to change, but it does not survive contact with reality. Men did adapt. They adapted by learning the rules as they actually functioned rather than as they were described. They adapted by recognizing that constant self sacrifice without reciprocal stability is not virtue, it is erosion. And once that realization sets in, the question stops being how to do better within the system and becomes whether the system itself is worth participating in at all. When men are young, they are often optimistic by default. They believe effort leads to reward. They believe fairness eventually emerges. They believe patience will be recognized. That optimism fuels participation. It encourages risk. It sustains investment. But optimism is not infinite. It is shaped by feedback. And when feedback repeatedly contradicts belief, belief changes. This is not cynicism, it is calibration. Over time, many men noticed that the metrics by which they were judged were vague, shifting, and often contradictory. They were expected to lead but not assert, to provide but not expect appreciation, to be confident but not decisive, to be emotionally open but not affected, to be present but not intrusive. These contradictions were not accidental. They created a permanent state of uncertainty where compliance was safer than clarity. But uncertainty is exhausting, and exhaustion eventually produces disengagement. What made disengagement possible was the discovery that the consequences of leaving were far less severe than promised. Men were warned that without relationships, they would be lonely, unfulfilled, and incomplete. Instead, many experienced the opposite. They found time, they found rest, they found financial breathing room, they found the ability to plan without negotiation. The absence of constant emotional friction created space for growth, and growth reinforced the decision to step back. This is where the narrative often breaks down because it assumes men are motivated primarily by approval. That assumption held for a long time because approval was positioned as scarce and valuable. But when approval became conditional, inconsistent, or weaponized, its value dropped. Men stopped chasing what could be withdrawn at any moment. They began investing in what they could control. Control is not about domination, it is about predictability. A man who controls his schedule, finances, health, and environment experiences lower stress. Lower stress produces better decision making. Better decision making produces stability. Stability produces peace. And peace is a powerful incentive. Another factor often ignored is how transparent incentives have become. In the past, social norms masked transactional dynamics. Expectations were implicit. Today, they are explicit. Men are told clearly what is expected of them. What they are rarely told is what they can expect in return. When transactions become one sided, participation declines. This is not ideological, it is universal human behavior. Men also observed how conflict was handled. In healthy systems, conflict leads to resolution. In unhealthy systems, conflict leads to escalation. Many men found that raising concerns resulted not in dialogue, but in character attacks. Motives were questioned, intentions were reframed, the discussion shifted from the issue to the individual. Over time, men learned that silence avoided punishment, but silence also removed connection. And without connection, there is little reason to stay. The rise of performative communication added another layer. Public signaling replaced private resolution, image management replaced honesty. Men found themselves navigating not just one relationship, but an audience. The cost of a misunderstanding was no longer confined. It could spill into social circles, workplaces, and online spaces. Risk multiplied. Withdrawal reduced exposure. This environment rewarded those who could tolerate chaos and punished those who valued stability. Men who preferred calm were labeled disengaged. Men who enforced boundaries were labeled difficult. Men who opted out were labeled afraid. But labels lose power when the labeled person no longer seeks approval from the labeler. As men stepped back, they began to see themselves more clearly. Without constant external evaluation, self assessment improved. Men could ask what they actually wanted rather than what they were expected to want. Many realized they preferred simplicity, fewer obligations, fewer compromises, more alignment between effort and outcome. This recalibration affected friendships as well. Men strengthened bonds with others who valued consistency and honesty. These relationships were quieter but more reliable. Support was offered without strings. Respect was mutual. The contrast was stark. The financial aspect of this shift cannot be ignored. Many men noticed how much money flowed outward during active participation. Dates, gifts, shared expenses, emergencies that were not their own. When that flow stopped, resources accumulated, savings increased, options expanded, financial security reduced dependence increased confidence, confidence reinforced independence. This created a feedback loop. Independence led to better outcomes. Better outcomes reduced the appeal of returning to unstable dynamics. Over time, the idea of compromise without benefit became unacceptable. Some observers interpret this as bitterness. It is not. Bitterness fixates on the past. This movement is oriented toward the present and future. Men are not dwelling on what went wrong, they are building what works. Another misconception is that men walking away reject intimacy entirely. This is false. They reject asymmetry. They reject environments where vulnerability is punished. They reject systems where accountability flows in only one direction. Intimacy without safety is not intimacy, it is exposure. Men learn the difference. As this learning spreads, Participation thresholds rise. Men become selective. They evaluate behavior rather than promises. They observe patterns rather than words. They move slowly. They invest cautiously. This frustrates those accustomed to immediate access, but caution is not hostility. It is wisdom earned through experience. There is also a quiet dignity in this movement that often goes unrecognized. Men are not seeking validation for leaving. They are not demanding recognition. They are simply choosing differently. That choice is personal, not performative. What makes this moment historically significant is that it coincides with broader instability, economic uncertainty, institutional distrust, rapid cultural shifts. In uncertain times, people retreat to what they can control. For many men, relationships cease to feel controllable. Outcomes felt arbitrary. Rules felt unstable. Stepping back restored balance. This is why appeals to tradition do not resonate. Men are not rejecting tradition. They are rejecting obligation without benefit. They are rejecting narratives that ask for sacrifice without offering security. They are rejecting roles that demand output without granting authority. The future trajectory of this movement depends on whether incentives change. If stability, respect, and mutual accountability become the norm, participation may increase. If not, withdrawal will continue. Men have already demonstrated that they can live well without constant relational engagement. That knowledge cannot be erased. Silence will continue to speak louder than argument. Absence will continue to reshape norms. Systems that rely on participation must adapt when participation declines. This is not a threat, it is a reality. Men are not waiting for permission, they are not asking for validation. They are choosing environments that reward effort and minimize chaos. They are protecting their peace. They are conserving their energy. They are living deliberately. And that deliberate living is the most disruptive thing of all, because it cannot be easily controlled, shamed, or redirected. This is where the conversation must go next, not toward accusation, but toward understanding incentives, toward recognizing that people respond rationally to their environments, toward acknowledging that stability is attractive and chaos is repellent. Men did not change overnight. They responded over years, and now the response is visible. This is not the end of connection. It is the end of illusions. It is the end of participation based on hope alone. It is the beginning of a more selective, more grounded approach to life. And that approach, once adopted, is very difficult to abandon. As this shift continues, it becomes increasingly clear that what unsettles many observers is not that men are unhappy, but that men are no longer asking to be made happy by someone else. For a long time, male contentment was framed as something granted rather than something built. Approval, affection, and acceptance were positioned as rewards for compliance. When men stopped orienting their lives around those rewards, the leverage disappeared. And when leverage disappears, so does influence. This is why independence is often mischaracterized as avoidance. It allows critics to dismiss irrational recalibration as an emotional failure. But avoidance implies fear, and fear implies weakness. What we are witnessing is not weakness, it is confidence born of experience. Men are not avoiding connection, they are avoiding instability. They are not running from responsibility, they are declining asymmetry. Another layer to this dynamic is how language has been used to obscure accountability. Terms were created to blur intent, expand interpretation, and redefine normal interaction as questionable. Over time, this produced an environment where clarity was punished and ambiguity was rewarded. Men learned that saying less reduced risk. They learned that distance protected reputation. They learned that neutrality was safer than engagement. This conditioning did not happen in isolation. It was reinforced by institutions, media narratives, and social incentives. Men who complied were praised until they were no longer useful. Men who questioned were labeled difficult. Men who withdrew were mocked. But mockery only works when someone cares about the opinion of the mocker. Men who have reclaimed self respect do not. The result is a quiet sorting process. Men who value calm gravitate toward solitude. Men who value purpose gravitate toward work and craft. Men who value freedom gravitate toward minimal obligation. These choices are not dramatic, they are deliberate. There is also an emotional maturity that emerges during this process that is rarely acknowledged. Men who walk away are forced to confront themselves honestly, without distraction, without external validation. They must decide who they are and what they want. This is not an easy process, but it is a clarifying one. Many discover that their previous motivations were shaped by expectation rather than desire. Once expectation is removed, desire simplifies. This simplicity is often mistaken for emptiness. In reality, it is focus. Men begin to measure success differently, not by applause, but by alignment, not by attention, but by peace, not by accumulation of status symbols, but by reduction of stressors. This shift does not require ideology, it requires only reflection. As men change how they live, they also change how they observe. They notice inconsistencies they once ignored. They see how narratives shift depending on outcome. They recognize patterns that repeat regardless of intent. This awareness does not make them cynical, it makes them discerning. One of the most important realizations men come to during this process is that not every problem is theirs to solve. For years, men were positioned as buffers between reality and discomfort. They absorbed pressure, conflict, and expectation in the name of harmony. When they stopped doing that, discomfort surfaced elsewhere. And instead of rushing back to contain it, men let it exist. This decision is often framed as abandonment, but abandonment implies obligation. Men cannot abandon responsibilities they never agreed to carry indefinitely. They can only stop volunteering for roles that harm them. That distinction matters. The broader cultural reaction to this withdrawal has revealed something important. When men step back, many systems struggle to function as designed. This suggests that those systems relied heavily on unacknowledged male participation. When participation is withdrawn, inefficiencies become visible. Stress increases. Complaints grow louder. But volume does not equal validity. Men are not obligated to maintain structures that disadvantage them. They are not required to subsidize instability. They are not responsible for correcting dynamics they did not create. Once this understanding settles in, guilt loses its grip. This does not mean men have become indifferent to others. It means they have become selective about where they invest care. Care without boundaries becomes depletion. Men have learned to set boundaries not as threats, but as necessities. Another important factor in this movement is how men relate to time. When constantly negotiating emotional dynamics, time feels fragmented. When living independently, time feels continuous. Men regain the ability to plan long term, to pursue goals without interruption, to rest without justification. This restoration of time is profoundly satisfying. The appeal of simplicity cannot be overstated. Simple routines, simple expectations, simple consequences. When effort leads to predictable results, motivation increases. When effort leads to confusion, motivation collapses. Men have chosen predictability. It is also worth noting that this movement has no central leadership, no manifesto, no demands. That makes it difficult to oppose because there is nothing to argue against. It is a series of individual decisions converging into a visible pattern. Patterns do not require permission. As more men opt out, those still participating experience yet increased pressure. Expectations concentrate, responsibility intensifies. This creates further incentive to withdraw. The cycle reinforces itself. Some have attempted to counter this by reframing independence as immaturity. But maturity is not defined by endurance of imbalance, it is defined by judgment. Men who recognize unhealthy patterns and adjust accordingly are not regressing, they are evolving. The real question is whether society can adjust its expectations in response. That requires acknowledging that past assumptions were flawed, that accountability must be mutual, that stability must be offered, not demanded. Whether that acknowledgement happens remains to be seen. What is certain is that men will not unlearn what they have learned. They have seen that peace is attainable. They have experienced life without constant friction. They have built routines that serve them. They will not trade that lightly. And this does not mean connection is impossible. It means connection must meet a higher standard. Respect must be consistent. Accountability must be shared. Stability must be real. Anything less will be declined. In this way, men walking away are not closing doors. They are raising threshold. They are redefining what participation means. They are asserting that their time, energy, and attention are valuable. That assertion is quiet, but it is firm, and it reshapes everything around it. The future will be shaped not by arguments, but by choices. Men have made theirs clear. They will live deliberately. They will protect their peace. They will invest where returns are fair. They will disengage where they are not. And as long as those choices continue to produce better outcomes, they will continue. This is not defiance. It is alignment. It is not withdrawal from life. It is engagement with it on healthier terms. That is the reality unfolding now, whether acknowledged or not. Another reason this shift has gained momentum is that men are increasingly aware of how emotional labor has been defined and distributed. For a long time, men were expected to absorb stress silently, resolve conflict without recognition, and regulate not only their own emotions, but also the emotional climate around them. This expectation was rarely acknowledged as labor. It was treated as baseline behavior, something men were simply supposed to do. Over time, many realized that this invisible workload had no endpoint and no reciprocal structure. When effort is endless and appreciation is optional, burnout is inevitable. Men also noticed that emotional narratives were often prioritized over factual consistency. Feelings became treated as outcomes rather than responses. This placed men in an impossible position. If a disagreement arose, resolution depended not on evidence or intent, but on whose emotional framing prevailed. That dynamic discourages honesty. It rewards strategic expression rather than sincere communication. Men adapted by reducing exposure to situations where truth was less important than perception. As men reduced exposure, they also reduced conflict. Fewer arguments, fewer misunderstandings, fewer moments where words could be reinterpreted later. This reduction had a compounding effect. Stress decreased, focus increased, confidence stabilized, and with stability came clarity. Clarity is often disruptive because it strips away illusions. Men began to see how often they were expected to compromise without negotiation, how frequently their boundaries were treated as obstacles rather than limits, how easily their concerns were reframed as personal flaws. Once seen clearly, these patterns could no longer be ignored. This clarity extended beyond relationships into culture more broadly. Men watched how narrative shifted depending on who benefited. They observed how responsibility was assigned selectively. They noticed that accountability was frequently framed as optional rather than essential. These observations reinforced the decision to disengage from systems that did not reward integrity. One of the most significant changes men experienced after stepping back was the restoration of internal validation. Instead of measuring themselves through external approval, they began measuring progress through tangible outcomes: health improvements, financial stability, skill acquisition, emotional regulation. These metrics were reliable. They could not be withdrawn by someone else. They did not fluctuate based on mood or narrative. This shift toward internal validation made men less reactive, less defensive, less inclined to argue. When you are no longer seeking approval, disagreement loses its emotional charge. Men learned that they did not need to convince anyone of their worth. They could demonstrate it through how they lived. This is where storytelling becomes important because a dominant story for decades framed men as incomplete without partnership. That story no longer matches lived experience for many. Men are writing new stories quietly through action rather than proclamation, stories of self sufficiency, stories of intentional living, stories of peace earned through restraint rather than conquest. These stories do not fit neatly into existing cultural categories. They are not traditional. They are not rebellious. They are adaptive. They reflect an understanding that modern environments require different strategies than past ones. Men are not rejecting history. They are responding to present conditions. Another overlooked aspect of this movement is how it affects communication styles. Men who have stepped back tend to speak less but mean more. They choose words carefully. They avoid unnecessary disclosure. This is not emotional shutdown, it is discernment. When words carry risk, they are used intentionally. This intentionality extends to commitment as well. Men are no longer committing by default, they are committing by evaluation. They assess consistency over time. They observe behavior under stress. They watch how conflict is handled. They look for alignment rather than persuasion. This approach slows everything down, which frustrates those accustomed to immediacy. But speed is not a virtue when consequences are long term. The slowing down of commitment has another effect. It filters out performative behavior. When there is no rush, masks slip, patterns emerge. Men are comfortable waiting because they are no longer afraid of being alone. That comfort is a powerful position. Many men also report a renewed sense of agency over their environment. They arrange their spaces to suit their needs. They structure their days to maximize energy. They build routines that support focus. These small choices accumulate into a life that feels coherent rather than reactive. This coherence makes external pressure easier to resist. When your life works, you do not feel compelled to justify it. You do not feel threatened by alternative choices. You simply continue. As this pattern becomes more common, it challenges long standing assumptions about motivation. Men were often portrayed as driven primarily by access to relationships. That portrayal underestimated their capacity for self direction. When external incentives weakened, men did not collapse, they recalibrated. This recalibration also changed how men view compromise. Compromise is valuable when it preserves stability and mutual respect. It is harmful when it erodes self respect. Men learned to distinguish between the two. They became willing to compromise on preferences, but not on principles. That distinction is critical. Another important realization was that constant negotiation is not intimacy. Intimacy is ease. It is mutual understanding without constant explanation. When relationships require endless negotiation to maintain basic harmony, something fundamental is missing. Men chose ease. The broader impact of this choice is visible in how men engage with society. They contribute where contribution is rewarded. They disengage where it is punished. This selective engagement improves overall well being. It also creates pressure on systems that assumed universal participation. Pressure reveals priorities. Systems that value contribution will adapt to retain it. Systems that rely on guilt will lose it. Men have already demonstrated their willingness to leave environments that do not meet basic standards of fairness. This does not mean men have become inflexible. It means they have become precise. They know what conditions they require to thrive. They know what patterns to avoid. They trust their observations. Trusting observation over narrative is one of the most significant changes in male psychology today. Men are no longer swayed by rhetoric alone. They look at outcomes. They compare claims to results. They adjust accordingly. This approach extends to media consumption as well. Men are filtering messages more critically. They are less responsive to emotional appeals. They are more attentive to incentives. This makes them harder to influence, but easier to respect. Respect is the key variable here. Men do not require constant affirmation. They require consistency. They require honesty. They require boundaries that are acknowledged rather than tested. When these conditions are present, engagement is possible. When they are absent, withdrawal is rational. As more men articulate this internally, even without speaking it publicly, the collective effect grows. Norms shift slowly at first, then suddenly. We are still in the slow phase, but momentum is building. What often goes unspoken is that many men would prefer balanced connection to solitude. Withdrawal is not always the first choice, it becomes the choice when alternatives fail repeatedly. If environments change, choices may change as well. But that change must be structural, not rhetorical. Men are no longer persuaded by promises of improvement. They look for evidence. They look for consistency over time. They look for accountability that applies equally. Until they see it, they will continue to choose peace. This choice is not dramatic. It does not require anger. It requires only awareness, awareness of patterns, awareness of costs, awareness of alternatives. And once awareness reaches a certain threshold, behavior changes naturally. That is where we are now. Awareness has crossed that threshold for many. The result is visible in quiet lives lived deliberately, in choices made without announcement, in priorities reordered around well being. Men walking away are not disappearing, they are redistributing themselves into lives that work. They are not rejecting society, they are engaging with it selectively. This selective engagement is not temporary, it is sustainable. It aligns with incentives. It produces results. And as long as it does, it will continue. As men continue to restructure their lives around peace rather than approval, another pattern becomes increasingly obvious, and that is how often discomfort is confused with harm. For years, men were expected to absorb discomfort quietly, whether that discomfort came from emotional instability, shifting expectations, or unresolved conflict. When men finally stopped absorbing it, that discomfort did not disappear. It simply became visible to those who had relied on men to manage it. Visibility created reaction, and reaction was misinterpreted as injustice rather than adjustment. This distinction matters because many modern conflicts are framed as moral failures rather than structural consequences. When men stop providing emotional buffering, others feel exposed. When men stop subsidizing instability, others feel pressure. But pressure is not oppression, it is feedback. And feedback is essential for systems to correct themselves. Men walking away are not creating new problems, they are revealing existing ones. The strain people feel now existed before. It was simply carried by someone else. Once men stopped carrying it, reality surfaced. That surfacing is uncomfortable, but discomfort is not evidence of wrongdoing. Another aspect of this movement that deserves attention is how it alters the way men experience identity. When identity is tied to external validation, it becomes fragile. It fluctuates based on approval and rejection. When men detach identity from approval, identity stabilizes. They are no longer defined by how useful they are to others, but by how aligned they are with themselves. This alignment reduces internal conflict. Men no longer feel torn between who they are and who they are expected to be. That internal harmony has measurable effects. Anxiety decreases, decision making improves, energy returns, and with energy comes creativity. Many men report rediscovering interests they abandoned years earlier, hobbies, physical challenges, learning for its own sake. These pursuits were often set aside in the name of compromise and responsibility. When compromise no longer dominates life, curiosity returns. This return is not regression, it is restoration. The restoration of curiosity is important because it reconnects men with intrinsic motivation. Instead of acting to avoid disapproval, they act to pursue growth. Intrinsic motivation is more durable than extrinsic pressure. It sustains effort without resentment. It produces satisfaction rather than exhaustion. This shift also changes how men relate to risk. Previously, risk was unavoidable. Engagement carried constant uncertainty. Withdrawal reduces unnecessary risk, allowing men to take calculated risks in areas that offer tangible reward. Career moves, investments, skill development, these risks are transparent. Outcomes are observable. Accountability is clear. Transparency is a recurring theme here. Men are not rejecting responsibility. They are rejecting opacity. They want to know the rules. They want consistency. They want cause and effect to align. When those conditions exist, men participate willingly. When they do not, men disengage. Another frequently misunderstood element is how this movement affects empathy. Critics often claim that men walking away lack empathy. The opposite is often true. Men who disengage emotionally do so precisely because they have learned empathy without boundaries leads to self harm. They still care, they simply care selectively. Selective empathy is healthier than indiscriminate empathy. It allows men to support without sacrificing themselves. It allows them to help without becoming responsible for outcomes they cannot control. This balance preserves compassion without enabling dysfunction. As men practice selective empathy, they also refine their social circles. Relationships become fewer, but stronger. Trust becomes deeper. Drama becomes rare. This refinement process mirrors what happens in any system under optimization. Noise is reduced. Signal is prioritized. This optimization extends into how men process criticism. When identity is internally anchored, criticism becomes information rather than attack. Men can evaluate feedback calmly. They can discard what is unfair. They can integrate what is useful. Emotional volatility decreases, stability increases. Stability, in turn, alters power dynamics. A stable man is not easily manipulated. He is not rushed by urgency. He is not swayed by threats of withdrawal. He is comfortable with silence. Silence is powerful because it removes leverage. This is why silence is often interpreted as hostility. It deprives others of feedback loops they are accustomed to controlling. But silence is not aggression, it is neutrality. And neutrality is often the most honest response. Another development worth noting is how men relate to expectations around sacrifice. Sacrifice has value when it is temporary and purposeful. It becomes destructive when it is permanent and taken for granted. Men walking away are not rejecting sacrifice entirely. They are rejecting endless sacrifice without recognition or reciprocity. This recalibration forces a reevaluation of narratives that framed male endurance as infinite. Men are finite. Their energy is finite. Their patience is finite. Recognizing those limits is not weakness, it is realism. Realism also influences how men view future planning. Without the assumption that they must constantly provide or rescue, men plan differently. They focus on sustainability. They build buffers. They prepare for uncertainty. This planning reduces anxiety and increases resilience. Resilience is another trait that emerges strongly in men who disengage. By removing themselves from emotionally volatile environments, they conserve resources. This conservation allows them to respond effectively when genuine challenges arise. They are no longer depleted by preventable stress. This resilience is often invisible because it lacks drama. There are no crises. There is no spectacle. There is simply steadiness. But steadiness is rare, and it attracts attention precisely because it contrasts with instability. As more men embody steadiness, cultural narratives struggle to keep pace. Old stories rely on conflict, they rely on reaction, they rely on emotional escalation. Steady men disrupt those stories by refusing to play assigned roles. Refusal is not rebellion, it is choice. Men are choosing where their energy goes. They are choosing environments that respect boundaries. They are choosing relationships that add value rather than subtract it. This choice does not require consensus. It does not require permission. It spreads through observation. One man sees another living calmly and asks how. The answer is rarely dramatic. It is simple: remove what harms you, keep what sustains you. Simplicity is often dismissed as naive, but it is the product of experience. Men simplify after complexity fails. They streamline after chaos exhausts them. They do not arrive at simplicity through ignorance, but through learning, and learning is the unifying thread here. Men learned that happiness is not something granted by others, it is constructed through choices. They learned that peace is not passive, it is protected. They learned that walking away is not defeat, it is strategy. Strategy implies foresight. Men are not reacting impulsively, they are thinking long term. They are asking whether current conditions align with future well being. If not, they adjust. Adjustment is not abandonment, it is adaptation. Humans adapt to environments constantly. Men are doing what humans have always done, they are responding to incentives. The incentive structure has changed. Participation no longer guarantees stability. Sacrifice no longer guarantees security. Engagement no longer guarantees respect. Given those changes, behavior shifts logically. What often surprises observers is how content many men are after disengaging. Contentment challenges narratives that predicted misery. It undermines arguments that men need constant relational involvement to thrive. Reality contradicts those claims. Contentment does not mean isolation. Many men remain socially connected. They maintain friendships, they engage professionally, they contribute meaningfully. They simply choose connection without entanglement. Entanglement is the key distinction. Men are not avoiding people, they are avoiding dynamics that entangle them in unresolvable conflict. This avoidance is rational. As this rationality becomes normalized, pressure tactics lose effectiveness. Fear loses power. Shame loses leverage. Men who know they can thrive independently cannot be coerced easily. This autonomy has ripple effects. It encourages other men to evaluate their lives honestly. It invites introspection. It creates permission to choose differently. Permission is important because many men felt trapped by expectation rather than desire. Seeing others opt out without catastrophe breaks the illusion of inevitability. It shows alternatives exist. Alternatives reduce fear. Reduced fear increases choice. Increased choice leads to better outcomes. This chain reaction is subtle but powerful. It does not announce itself, it simply unfolds. What we are witnessing now is the normalization of male self-preservation. For too long, self-preservation was framed as selfishness. Men are reclaiming it as necessity. Necessity is not negotiable. When something is necessary for well-being, it must be protected. Men are protecting their well-being. They are doing so calmly, quietly, without spectacle. And that quiet protection is reshaping the social landscape in ways that will become more visible over time. This is not a moment, it is a shift. And shifts, once underway, do not reverse easily. As this movement reaches maturity, what becomes undeniable is that men have not withdrawn from life, meaning, or responsibility, but have instead redefined what responsibility looks like when it is no longer anchored to obligation without reciprocity. Men have learned that responsibility chosen freely produces strength, while responsibility imposed indefinitely produces resentment and collapse. This distinction has reshaped how men evaluate every commitment they consider because they now ask a different question than they did before. The question is no longer whether they are capable of enduring something, but whether enduring it produces a life worth living. This reframing is essential because endurance without purpose is not virtue, it is erosion. Men spent decades being praised for how much pressure they could absorb while receiving little concern for the cost of that absorption. When they stopped absorbing it, many were accused of abandoning others, but in truth, they were reclaiming themselves. A man who constantly sacrifices his stability eventually has nothing left to offer anyone, including himself. Walking away was not a rejection of contribution, but a refusal to self destruct. What makes this shift so durable is that it is grounded in lived outcomes rather than ideology. Men are not debating theory, they are comparing lives. They are comparing the version of themselves that existed under constant emotional strain with the version that exists after stepping away. And the difference is not subtle. Energy returns, focus sharpens, confidence stabilizes, peace becomes the baseline rather than the exception. Once this comparison is made honestly, there is no argument strong enough to undo it. Men also recognize now that peace is not passive. Peace requires boundaries, discernment, and the willingness to disappoint expectations that do not serve long term well being. This willingness was once discouraged, framed as selfishness or avoidance. But men have learned through experience that pleasing everyone is impossible, and pleasing oneself responsibly is essential. Responsibility to the self is not indulgence, it is the foundation of all sustainable contribution. Another important realization that marks the final stage of this transition is that men do not need to justify their choices to those who do not share their incentives. Explanation was once a reflex, an attempt to be understood, but men have learned that understanding is not always offered in good faith. Silence is often more honest than explanation because silence refuses to participate in distortions. A man who lives well does not need approval to validate his direction. This confidence does not manifest as arrogance, it manifests as calm. Calm men are difficult to provoke because they are no longer defending fragile identities. They are no longer negotiating for acceptance. They are grounded in their routines, their values, and their results. That grounding is what makes them appear distant to those who rely on emotional volatility to feel engaged. Calm is often mistaken for coldness by those who are accustomed to chaos. The broader implication of this calm is that men are no longer easily mobilized by panic, urgency, or guilt. Appeals that once triggered immediate compliance now fall flat because men have learned to ask what happens after compliance. They have learned to follow incentives forward rather than stopping at intention. This analytical approach protects them from repeating past mistakes. Men are also becoming more honest with themselves about what connection actually means. Connection without trust is performance. Connection without stability is stress. Connection without accountability is exploitation. Men are not rejecting connection, they are rejecting false versions of it. They are waiting for alignment rather than chasing proximity. This waiting is often misinterpreted as absence, but it is not absence from life. It is presence in one's own life. Men are present in their health, their work, their personal growth, and their inner peace. They are no longer scattered across endless obligations that drain rather than build. This presence produces satisfaction that cannot be replicated through external validation. As men become more present with themselves, they become less reactive to social pressure. Trends lose power. Narratives lose urgency. Opinions lose weight unless they are grounded in reality. This does not make men disconnected from society. It makes them selective participants within it. They engage where engagement makes sense. They withdraw where it does not. This selective participation is the defining feature of the current era. Men are no longer default contributors. They are conditional contributors. They offer their time, energy, and resources where fairness exists and withhold them where it does not. This is not punishment, it is discernment. Discernment is the product of experience applied honestly. The future will not be shaped by arguments about who is right or wrong. It will be shaped by where people choose to invest their lives. Men have already cast their vote through behavior. They have chosen peace over chaos, clarity over confusion, and autonomy over dependency. These choices accumulate quietly, but they reshape norms over time. What remains for society to decide is whether it will adapt to these choices or continue demanding participation without reform. Demands without incentive eventually fail. Cooperation requires mutual benefit. Stability requires shared accountability. Men have made it clear that they will no longer substitute themselves for systems that refuse to correct their own imbalances. This does not mean reconciliation is impossible. It means reconciliation must be real. Words without structural change will not suffice. Promises without consistency will not persuade. Men will watch actions, patterns, and outcomes because that is what experience has taught them to trust. Men walking away are not closing the door permanently. They are standing still and asking whether the environment beyond the door has changed. If it has not, they will remain where they are, because where they are is peaceful, stable, and sustainable. That is not stubbornness, it is wisdom. The most important lesson men have learned through this process is that happiness is not something to chase. It is something to protect. Protection requires boundaries. Boundaries does require courage. Courage requires clarity. And clarity comes from paying attention to reality rather than narrative. Men paid attention. They learned. They adjusted. They are now living the results of those adjustments, and the results speak louder than any argument ever could. At the end of all of this, what stands out is not anger, not resentment, and not conflict, but quiet resolution. Men have resolved to live deliberately. They have resolved to preserve their energy. They have resolved to invest in what strengthens them rather than what weakens them. That resolution does not seek permission and does not need validation. This is why the movement continues without slogans, without leaders, and without demands. It is sustained by outcomes. It is reinforced by peace. It is strengthened by clarity. And it grows because it works. Now, I want to know what you think about everything that was discussed here. Do you agree with these observations? Do you see these patterns playing out in your own life or around you? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter and they shape how people see their own experiences. Like the video if you like it, do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video and just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.